So I'm going to invite David and James and Bill up to the microphones at the table, and here is our chance to grill them. Does anyone want to kick us off? Oh, we've got one at the back. Yeah, go for it.
Do you think that the PRRT will become the first line of treatment eventually?
So the question is, and I think it's a good one because I wrote it down as a bit of a Dorothy Dix. If no one put their hands up, I was going to ask this. So it is...
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is, sorry, is because my understanding is that some statin reacts to lanreotide and eventually it can weaken the response. And I thought that the radiation needed sort of a very high response rate to work.
So the question to our panel is, do we think that PRRT in time will become first-line management in neuroendocrine tumours? And I can see Bill's got the microphone.
But I think that both David and I should have a crack at this. So I don't know is the honest answer because no one's done the comparison. I somehow suspect not. And what you might not have got from the presentation I gave, because I didn't have the time, is that octreotide and lanreotide have already been evaluated against no treatment at all, and they're significantly better than no treatment at all. They don't involve irradiation, and whilst they do produce some side effects in people, particularly at high doses, the side effect profile is not that bad, and it's a treatment that you can take for a very long time without cumulative toxicity. Radiation treatments, the ones that we use in the quantities that we use them, are reasonably well tolerated, but they do have some toxicity. It's a greater toxicity than you see with the somatostatin analogues. And there's probably a limit to how much you can give people before you start to make them really sick. We haven't yet reached that limit, but I'm sure it exists. So if I was thinking of a logical way to do this, I wouldn't be starting off with a treatment that I suspect has a capacity limit, and I would save it for a role that it's been demonstrated to be useful in, which is when the octreotide and the lanreotide have stopped working as well as we'd like. And I think that the sequence that we've got at the moment is probably appropriate. Now, it hasn't been proven to be appropriate, but it makes sense to me. Where I think PRRT could start to replace other treatments would be in some of the other second-line treatments that are used in people with NETs. So drugs like everolimus or sunitinib or chemotherapy, it may be that PRRT would be a preferred treatment to them. And that's the next phase of clinical trials which are coming on stream, and they will start. I mean, there are a few of them around the world which are in planning or have commenced. And so if I was diagnosed with a NET today, I would start on a somatostatin analogue if I needed treatment, and I would save PRRT for down the track.
I can't. So our current order of treatment, generally speaking, are a few patients with very low volume, low-grade tumours we observe, and my record for observing is 8 years and still doing okay. Now, there aren't that many patients that we select for observation, but we do select a few. Our next line of treatment is usually a somatostatin analogue, and if that fails, it's peptide receptor radiotherapy, then everolimus or sunitinib, and after that, if that doesn't work, it's capecitabine temozolomide, is the usual order that we give things. Should we mix up the order? Not at the moment, I don't think. You know, peptide receptor radiotherapy is not a nothing treatment. There's a risk of leukemia. I have 2 patients with leukemia post-PRRT, and we need to keep that side effect in mind. So we are offering sometimes peptide receptor radiotherapy when patients have what we call extremely bulky disease. So if you've got 3/4 or 7/8 of your liver replaced with tumour, we sometimes think, wow, you know, we haven't got a lot of goes at this thing. If this tumour gets out of control, the patient will become very sick and untreatable, and therefore we use usually lanreotide and peptide receptor radiotherapy as the initial treatment, because we don't think that we've got a lot of options later on down the track. And then the other bit of data is that, you know, from other cancers, generally speaking, the order that you give things isn't particularly important. As long as you get all the treatments in sometime in the patient's journey, how long people live, generally speaking, doesn't matter much as to which order that you give them in. But certainly for most patients on a somatostatin analogue, out of all the treatments that are available, it's the least toxic and probably has the least long-term problems with it.
There is a trial which is being conducted in Europe. I think it's closed to recruitment now, so they're not bringing any new patients on, but there's no results yet, where people were randomised to lanreotide alone or lanreotide plus PRRT. But it was a relatively small trial, and it'll be at least 2 or 3 years before we know what the difference between those 2 groups is. So it's conceivable that some people would be recommended for upfront PRRT plus lanreotide or octreotide, as David's alluded to, particularly the ones with more severe disease. But I don't expect that it would become a routine recommendation.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? While you're thinking, Melissa, go.
2 simple questions. The first one, can grade 1 disease progress to grade 2 and then grade 3?
So let's start with that question first. Can grade 1 disease progress
yes.
or change into grade 2
So
or
we
grade 3?
can get what we call transformation. It's pretty unusual, but you can, a clone of cells can transform. So the answer is yes.
How would you know or monitor that? Do you do a second read test?
Usually we would look at the pace of the disease, and then if the pace of the disease was slow for a long time and then suddenly took off, we would say that probably the tumour is transformed to a high-grade tumour. You know, what's the value? Do we always do a biopsy? No, to see if there's transformation. For high-grade tumours, if we saw something that had taken off, we'd probably go, this is transformed, and move to a high-grade treatment anyway, because even if the biopsy came back as low-grade and the thing was really going fast on CT, we wouldn't believe the biopsy.
Sometimes you can also find that in people who have, and I'll give an example, a theoretical example, people who have 15 tumour deposits in their body, that 14 of those might be reasonably well-behaved tumour deposits, and there'll be one nasty pasty that's behaving in a different way and has a different kind of biology to the others. Now, whether or not it all came from the same parentage, at the present time we assume that that's the case, and then, you know, one's just gone feral. But there is sometimes a need to use a particular treatment against that one tumour deposit when a different kind of treatment will be adequate for the others. And we don't quite yet understand how that happens, because all we're looking at any given point in time is a snapshot. We don't know in an individual person how things have changed from month to month. And sometimes we do 2 PET scans in people. So we've got the gallium octreotide PET scans, which is kind of our mainstay in this condition. But there's also another kind of PET scan called FDG, and sometimes we'll choose to do both of those PET scans in order to see if all of the tumour deposits in someone are made the same way, or do some of them appear to be different. And if they are, that might need a different kind of treatment approach.
Did you have another question, Melissa?
Unrelated, but with new treatments. 2 years ago in the similar forum, we heard about Dr. Nat Enzo at Hollywood trying another type of PRRT using different radioactive techniques, a variant of the I wonder what the progress is with that.
Yeah, so the question's about are there other PRRT treatments in the pipeline? What's the research showing with different radioactive isotopes?
So the short answer is yes, there are. And I'll just, I skipped over this slide, so I'll go back to it. There is 2 kinds of, so you've got these somatostatin receptors on people's cells, and we have 2 types of drugs that attach to those receptors. One of them is called an agonist, and an agonist will attach to the somatostatin receptors when they have been activated. So they're like light switches, they get turned off and on and we don't really know why. But lanreotide and octreotide are both somatostatin receptor agonists. So they behave a little bit like somatostatin. And you can see here in this slide on the right that when the receptor is switched on, in the blue here, that the agonist will attach to it, but when the receptor is switched off, the agonist won't. And that's because when you switch these things off and on, they have these minor chemical changes that happen which make the receptor sexy or not to the molecule. Antagonists have a different kind of chemistry, and they will attach to the receptors whether they're switched on or off, and therefore you can get more of the chemical onto the cell. Now, if you can imagine each one of these carries a radiation payload, then you're delivering more radiation to the cell as a consequence of this different chemistry. And therefore it would be logical to predict that the response to those treatments might be better. It's also possible that the toxicity will be greater. And so the new treatment could be a double whammy. It works better, but also does you more harm. And so at the moment, all that's happened is a phase 1 study where, and Hollywood was a participating site in this, where about a dozen people around the world have been given this stuff and in varying doses, and we know that they survived, and the company who sponsors this, which is Ipsen, has some knowledge about how much to use. There is now going to commence a phase 2A study where a small number of people will be given the treatment on a recurring basis to see how well it works. And the problem with slowly growing cancers is you have to wait a fair while to know how well it works. And then that will be followed by a 2B treatment, where phase 2B trial, where a larger number of people will be given the treatment for a longer period of time, using the results from the previous trial. And then in a little while, and I'm thinking some years, we'll be in a position to do a phase 3 trial where we compare that treatment with what we're already using. But it's in order to do it properly, it's a methodical and relatively slow process. So the work is underway. The initial results are intriguing, but there's not much more to say than that. And the amount of drug that you can get onto each cell appears to be around about 3 to 4 times what you can get with octreotide. So, you know, it's worth pursuing.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm glad you asked that question because it was on my list of Dorothy Dix's. So you're all gradually working your way through them. It's fantastic. We're all thinking of the same things to ask. Other questions? There's one over there. Yep.
David, you said just a little while ago that only a small number of people have observation, and you've had some people up to 8 years. What are the criteria just for observation and no other treatment initially?
So the question
so
is,
the
I'll just repeat the question, and that is, what's the criteria for someone to be on observation rather than starting on a somatostatin analogue straight away?
Okay, so first thing is, if you've had a net tumour completely resected and there's no visible tumour at the end of the operation, those patients don't get treatment in any circumstance, well, they don't. So the situation where we're talking about observation is when we know the tumour has come back, we know that it's there, and we know that because of the distribution of where it's come back, we can't surgically resect it for a whole lot of technical reasons. So we would offer observation to people with a gastrointestinal grade 1 low volume metastatic disease.
So not grade 2?
Not grade 2.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, thank you. Michael.
With the long-term use of lanreotide and that, we focus on, or have our PET scans, we keep going, make sure everything's at bay. But what about the actual heart, the valves where it can develop collagen and all that? I mean, do we take our eye off that?
Did you look at my list of questions, Michael? Because that was okay, this is great. You're really thinking of all the things that I thought of, yeah. And so the question is, what about the heart, and particularly for patients who I guess are on treatment for a really long time? What do we know about the impact of neuroendocrine tumours on the heart, and particularly what are we doing about it? I think as well. Is that?
So the issue. So as far as we know, lanreotide itself is not cardiac toxic. So the drug itself is not the problem. The problem is a thing called carcinoid heart disease. Now, carcinoid heart disease only occurs in patients with carcinoid syndrome. So carcinoid syndrome is where you get the flushing and really bad diarrhoea. Patients who just have the tumour that's non-hormone secretory, generally speaking, don't get carcinoid heart disease. Carcinoid heart disease is a disease that affects some of the valves in the heart. We've been, I must admit the program's not been particularly rigorous, but for those patients with clear-cut symptoms, we should be doing an echocardiogram occasionally to screen for carcinoid heart disease.
So David, can I just ask if there are people here or people who are watching this on video who have carcinoid syndrome and haven't had an echocardiogram, that's something that they should talk with their doctor about?
Yeah.
Cool, I'll tick that off my list. Other questions?
And not everyone with carcinoid syndrome gets carcinoid heart disease. So.
And the other thing is that we think the somatostatin analogues actually decrease the incidence. You know, people used to talk about a lot. Number of patients that I've got with genuine carcinoid heart disease is tiny.
I suppose the other question that leads on with lanreotide long term and that, and you said we've got a dietitian coming later in the year, which is fantastic. But I mean, things like vitamin deficiency and malabsorption with someone and that.
Yeah, we had
things that
one of the sessions.
Really
Yeah,
need to know about.
yeah, and I'm glad you raised that. I'm actually going to address that because there was a session at ENETS in Barcelona that was a nurses session. So I'm suspecting that Bill might not have got along to that one, and there was a real focus on dietitian there were two dietitians that presented at that session. There's been some really interesting work done and more work being done looking very specifically at vitamin deficiencies for people generally with neuroendocrine tumours, but then more specifically with who are on the somatostatin analogues. And they said that the incidence of vitamin deficiencies and side effects generally are much higher than the literature would suggest. And so there's been some very interesting conversations since that time around should we be recommending that people with carcinoid syndrome, for example, routinely supplement vitamin B, and the consensus amongst the dietitian community in Australia is probably yes. And we're in the process, the Unicorn Foundation are in the process of putting together, compiling a fact sheet that will be on our website with some specific recommendations, particularly around B group vitamins, but also we know that somatostatin analogues in a large percentage, and the statistics were presented at ENETS. They were saying up to 84% of people are showing symptoms of fat malabsorption when they're on the somatostatin analogues, which means that they're not absorbing fat well from their diet, and we worry about their risk of vitamin deficiencies in the fat-soluble vitamins in their diet. And so we are thinking more about, do we need to supplement other vitamins as well? So it's an area that's being researched now. There's a PhD student at Peter Mac who's looking at that. She's doing blood tests and all sorts of things of people. So we'll know more quite soon. Within the next couple of years we'll know a lot more. But yeah, there's lots of work being done. And good questions to ask the dietitian when she comes to the support group. We've got time for just maybe one or two more questions, and David wanted to comment.
Comment about diet. This is not a net tumour specific thing. So some people change their diet radically with the diagnosis of cancer. In my view, there is no. I think generally people who radically change their diet do worse. Weight loss in cancer is a major problem. Perhaps not such a big issue for NET patients, but certainly for a lot of other cancer patients, marked weight loss is a major problem. Going on to a vegan diet, going on to a really calorie-restricted diet, I think is positively harmful. And in my view, there's no evidence to show that changing your diet radically after the diagnosis of cancer is going to make any difference to how you do in the long run, and I generally would not advise it.
So we've got time for one more before we go to our next part of the evening. Has anyone else got any burning questions?
I've got one. One of the side effects of somatostatin analogues is it makes diabetes worse, type 2 diabetes worse. Does it get to a stage where you consider dropping the dose or cutting out the analogue, or just continue to treat the diabetes and end up on insulin, those kind of things? It's a generic question.
So the question is around the impact of somatostatin analogues on. Yeah, so the effect of lanreotide. I'm just going to repeat the question for the video. Sorry, stickler there. But so the effect of somatostatin analogue injections when someone's got diabetes, and the diabetic control is tricky, and how to balance those two needs of maintaining a steady blood sugar, but also obviously wanting to be treating the NET.
To my mind, it depends on the indication for the somatostatin analogue. If you're giving the somatostatin analogue to control tumour growth and you've achieved stable disease, I would have thought, generally speaking, your NET tumour was a bigger risk to your long-term health than your diabetes, and therefore I would ramp up the treatment for the diabetes, because if your NET tumour's under control, I'm pretty happy, and and just ramp up the diabetes treatment. sometimes the indications from somatostatin analogues become a bit vague. You know, do we continue the drug beyond progression? It's a bit of a vexed question. So if the indication for the drug was a bit marginal, and not sure if you really needed it or not, and you were running into lots of problems with your diabetes, I might withdraw it in that situation. But if you were having symptoms, bad diarrhoea and bad flushing, and you were well controlled, I'd ramp up your diabetes treatment.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone, for your great questions. And thank you. Oh, Bill wants to have the last word, so let's go.
I always want to have the last word, and I didn't want to let James off the hook, but I just wanted to finish by saying that at one point in my life I needed some counselling, some psychotherapy, and I'm a radiation doctor, so, you know, I work at exactly the opposite end of the healthcare spectrum to James. I fill people up with radiation, but when I had psychotherapy, I was astonished how effective it was and how much better I felt as a result. So those of you who feel nervous about taking that step, I know that James addressed this in his slides, don't. It's a very helpful thing to do when you need it.
Thank you, and well said. Thank you, Bill. Look, I'd like you to thank all of our guests. It's been really amazing.